Good morning and hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth and final session in NRDC and NRDC India's series of climate conversations. My name is Vyoma Jha. I'm the India Clean Energy Senior Advocate at NRDC. All week, we have convened experts across a variety of climate related topics, from India's role in climate action to funding the transition to a low carbon economy, from the role of women as agents of change in the climate fight to making sustainable and affordable cooling a reality for all. Today, I'm happy to welcome you to our final session, Tackling the Climate Crisis, a Mass Lifestyle Movement, that will discuss what we can do as individuals to move the ball forward on climate action. We're joined by three very eminent speakers this morning or evening, whichever part of the world you're joining us from. First up is Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri, who's Distinguished Fellow at the Energy and Resources Institute. Ambassador Puri joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1982 and has served as Ambassador of India to the European Union, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Nepal. Major areas of his experience and professional focus relate to the environment, in particular climate change and sustainable development, having served as a lead negotiator for India at the United Nations on issues relating to the post-2015 development agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and various climate change negotiations held at the UNFCCC. Next up, we have Shuva Raha, Fellow and Lead International Cooperation at the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. Shuva has over 25 years of experience in public policy, project management, corporate operations, and branding. In her current role at CEW, Shuva's portfolio spans four regions: Asia, Oceania, Africa, Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. She drives she drives global governance-centric energy development climate initiatives amid geoeconomic transformations, covering a wide gamut of energy and resource security, decarbonization, sustainable finance, sustainable production and consumption, and climate resilience. Last but not the least, we have Yamide Dagnet, Senior Vice President of the International Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Yamide is responsible for leading the vision and strategy for NRDC's international program. Prior to joining NRDC, Yamide worked in philanthropy, where she raised significant support for climate adaptation projects and efforts to tackle unavoidable losses and damages due to climate change. She focused on bridging and protecting diverse voices for just, equitable energy and industrial transitions while promoting scaled up and more accessible sustainable development and climate finance. She has also fostered reflection and support on just green energy and industrial transitions. This session today will be moderated by Urmi Goswami, climate and environment reporter and the lead writer for the Economic Times. Urmi writes on issues related to the environment, climate change, energy transitions, clean energy sustainable development, and education. I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers, moderator, as well as the audiences joining virtually, and will hand it over to Urmi to take us through the rest of the hour.
Thanks, Vyoma. And once again, welcome to everybody, to the speakers, the panelists, and of course, to our audience. Um, so today's focus is on tackling the climate crisis and mass lifestyle movement. Uh, in India, we are sort of, we have the mission life, so we have a sense of what this mass movement, for sustainable lifestyle is. But before we sort of launch off, there's um, sorry, before we launch off, I would just like to flag off that there is a climate insight on mass lifestyle movement prepared by the NRDC. I would request all of you to sort of have a look at it and give a sense of where the conversation is, and and insights into what's happening in terms of how sustainable lifestyle and tackling climate crisis. Uh, on the face of it, sustainable lifestyles, when we talk about it, sounds like, feel good, nice, warm, fuzzy subject. But in reality, it is where the idea of sustainable consumption and production meets the road. It's really at some level, it's the core of how we ensure we move towards sustainability, or we maintain a lifestyle in which the earth remains in balance, not just in terms of climate, but across all the environmental parameters. Therefore, it becomes interesting when we start noticing that that when in the Paris Agreement, sustainable lifestyle was in the preamble. By the time we come years, almost then 8 years later, to the first global stock take, it is actually mentioned in as part of the UAE consensus. So sustainable lifestyle is not just something that we want to achieve and that's nice to achieve. It has actually moved to where it has become one of the things where there has to be more conversation on, and hence our conversation today. So without any more introduction, I will move to our discussants. Start with you, Mr. Puri. You know, the whole idea of mission life, which India has sort of uh, put forward, sought to make it a global sort of mass movement, stems from the idea that India has its emissions have been low. It is generally more frugal or more conservative in its emission, in its footprint, and therefore, and yet we recognize that as a growing society, as a growing economy, that footprint could get elongated. It's no, it won't remain as short as it used to be. When we look around us, especially in our cities, but even otherwise, but even in our cities in India, we see there is an affluence. The numbers tell us there is growing affluence. And what we see is the outward expression of that affluence, and those aspirations that people have, they seem to match an aspiration which belongs to a non-sustainable era. I'm wondering how do you match this? Is mission How do you match the desire or the aim of mission life to have a sustainable lifestyle, the aspirations and the affluence? How do we come to a confluence?
Uh, Urmi, thank you very much. First, just a clarification. I am speaking here on my own behalf, not on the behalf of the government of India, certainly, not even Terry. Shuva perhaps may know more about the government of India's thinking on the matter. So let me start by saying a few things. You know, the idea of, you mentioned the word frugality. Look, we are a frugal society. Part of it is because we are a poor country. We are also not a resource rich country in terms of minerals and these kind of resources, etc. Uh, Therefore, lifestyles is something that we've always brought up in the context of climate negotiations and made this point repeatedly. Now, in Glasgow, Prime Minister Modi articulated this as a national vision to be taken internationally and termed it the life mission, lifestyles for environment. Uh, Therefore, it sits very well with us. It's something that we would like everybody to understand and appreciate. And you are right. Of course, on the negotiating perspective, it comes from the fact that, you are trying to position yourself in the negotiations, take some leadership positions and so on. Perfectly fine. Legitimate things to do. All countries do that. And the more powerful, the more that they try to set the agenda along the items that suit them. But let me come to this. So we do recognize, first of all, very clearly in India that the idea of mission life doesn't mean that people remain where they are or go even below that. So to use a simplistic expression, go back to the bullock carts. No, 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 no. Nobody's saying that. Nothing wrong with the bullock carts. A good way of transportation. But, that's not the idea. Let me use a simplistic expression to describe this. A, consumption needs to become smarter, not only in the developing world, which is still getting into the consumption cycle, but also in the developed world, which continues to be the largest emitter in various senses. The Chinese, in my understanding, can today only be called a developed country. given where they are, both in terms of the size of their economy and in terms of their per capita. So, smartness is something important. Also, all the actions that are being taken, move to EVs, electrification, tackle the hard-to-abate sectors, and all that we are doing in terms of adaptation, etc. All of these are important. But I want to make another point to you. And Urmi, this goes to what you mentioned to Yamide, the question about negotiation. Look, these negotiations, where have they started from? It's very interesting. They've all started basically from the perspective of A, reduction, mitigation, and C, production and a degree of sustainability in production. So today, the mitigation, I don't know what will happen in the country where Yoma and Yamide are sitting. We have to wait for the 5th of or 20th of January and see what happens. But basically speaking, most of the world has accepted that, we have to do something about sustainability in production. So are we in India. Whether it's the EVs business or telling our cement industry to become, more GHG conscious, or the steel industry, or every other aspect, we've all accepted. But have we all really accepted, especially in the developed world, the idea of sustainability in consumption? And I am not going into the entire question of how do you count GHG emissions for production or consumption. That's a completely different subject altogether, very contentious and legally challenging. But the question of sustainability in consumption, has it really gone on? Have you seen the per capita GHG emissions in the countries which are among the richest in terms of per capita income? Even the Europeans who pride themselves in a lot of what they've achieved, and I'm not talking about, again, the country where NRDC is based, the figures are astronomically high. I'm not talking about the Gulf states either. So therefore, sustainability in consumption is perhaps the most important element. And I'm glad to see that, these negotiations, while life being accepted by the G20 in various formats, getting a mention in the UNFCCC. It's moving in the direction of nudging people that it's not just production sustainability that we are looking at, get rid of fossil fuels, do that, but also in terms of sustainability in terms of consumption. To cut my entire other business short, India comes from an ethos of Gandhiji. The earth has enough for our needs, but not greed. Are we a country which is not looking at the world? As we are becoming increasing members of the globalized world, we also have our ambitions, our aspirations set by the same thing. And you were very right in saying that's what the average Indian looks to, feel, and so on. But can you, as an institution, help him do it smartly? Can you make him realize that let's do it a little better? A very simple thing, a very simple example for those of us who sit in metros and who have a certain degree of affordability. Are you willing to say that your next car should be an EV? A simple matter like that. Are you willing to say that you will do recycling? Are you willing to say that you yourself will eschew heavy packaging? Are you willing to do all of this? You will set an example. You then demonstrate to your countrymen, and through that, there is global recognition. The global south leads from each other, and hopefully the ideas also catch on in the rest of the world. Let me pause here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very interesting the way when you focus on consumption, sustainability in consumption, but also try to match it with the question on aspiration, which I'd asked. That how do we ensure that those who are now going to be the new consumers are not consuming in an unsustainable fashion without being made to feel that they are not being able to, meet their aspirations. So that's a tricky balance that we need to do. Shiva, I'll come to you because eh, you just heard Mr. Puri talk about, in a way, explain the tricky balance that we have to, that somewhat tight walk rope, and it's a difficult conversation, not just for developing countries, as you mentioned. It's also there in developed countries. Basically, who wants to give up their current way of life? It's difficult. You're asking for too much, and then if that is the set norm, then how do you ask those who are now coming in to give up? So then, to sort of now therefore we need to start threading the needle in a different way. So when we are looking at sustainable lifestyles, which are the sectors you think that need to be tackled as priority, so that the gains are the most, you know, instead of like going all the way uh, through every sector and leading to too many pain points, which then have political repercussions. So I was wondering if you could give us a sense of a, like a cheat list.
So I think Ambassador Puri has said some couple of interesting points that I want to continue from. One is the way India has defined the lifestyles for environment and the question of degrowth, etc., that comes in with austerity, I would say. So life says that we should look at mindful utilization and not a mindless consumption. So there's a difference between what you need, and that's a point Dr. Ambassador Puri made, um, versus what you're just consuming for the sake of it, the dopamine hit, if you will. So here is where the challenge comes in between developing, etc., is that we have not defined what is sustainable in terms of being subsistence, that's a word that was used, versus luxury. What do you really need? What is utilization versus what is a luxury or a consumption, mindless, etc. So, but we are very clear that we are not asking for people to give up anything. The other challenge that Ambassador Puri closed with, that what are we willing to do as individual behaviors? And when we were working with the government, the ministries, the Niti Aayog, which is our think tank, official think tank, and we were working with the G20 Secretariat when we were framing the high-level principles for lifestyle for sustainable development, which is the word that was accepted by the G20 during negotiations. We were very clear that there's going to be no mandates or bans or punitive measures or even over-regulation on the individual while going in for this. So the framing is sort of like you're nudging behaviors. That leads to enabling markets. The market forces then come in to redefine the way we look at our livelihoods and our lifestyles, etc., which then leads to policy. Unlike you would recall the single-use ban, etc., where there are certain random top-down bans, they don't work, we don't have alternatives, the trade-offs are too high, and that is what leads to failure of such models. There's a little bit of difference in this thinking between us and, let's say, the EU. I'm not talking about the US because that's a slightly different paradigm. Where EU is looking at heavy regulations, EPRs, this, that. There is just entanglement of the industry, the MSMEs, what the individuals can and cannot do. And beyond a point, the political economy of this does not work out because it frustrates the citizens. Now, if I look at the low-hanging fruits, which you've asked, for countries that are developing, like India, etc., where the large population is cannot afford certain things even if they want to, and I'm talking life systems, not clothes and things. A lot of it is being delivered by the government. So I would say the power sector, greening of the power sector. So a lot of the energy, about 13% of the energy that we get bundled with our normal electricity is from renewables. My mother doesn't know that, doesn't care about that, but she is a participant in the greening of our electricity sector. We've done similar things with the Ujjwala Yojana, where we had LPG connections given to the rural and below poverty line. Now you would say the LPG is not a green fuel. So that is where we get into taxonomic debates. But if you're looking at, is it better than coal in terms of emissions or burning, wood, biomass, etc., in small spaces, what are the co-benefits to health? So for a developing nation or a country, the co-benefits also matter because that's the total cost of delivering a good service or something that is going towards screening. Again, if I come back and I take my mother as the example for any of the recommendations that we make, because she's 77, she's a senior citizen, she's capable of certain things and she's not capable of some things. So when Ambassador Puri asked that, do I have a comment? Do I have a solar panel on my roof? No, I don't, because we don't have the capacity to maintain it individually. But am I going to support the government if it gives me clean energy through the grid? Yes. I mean, that is where individual behaviors, we have to be very careful on what is the capacity of an individual to do certain things. So if we are talking then about the PNG connections in the households, the acceptability of that was very high because it removed the drudgery of getting an LPG cylinder, reordering, waiting, going there, etc. It's piped, you switch it on. In such a case, consumer behavior accepts very easily. So even my 77-year-old mother is very happy with her PNG connection after a lifetime of LPG. So she has actually made a second level green transition, which was acceptable to her. At the same time, is a solar panel on her roof acceptable to her? No, she cannot deliver it. So we have to be very clear on what we are trying to get the population to do. And this goes down to whether you're segregating your garbage or what sort of material are you recycling, because that's another point that Ambassador Puri made. Where do you go to recycle anything anyway? So easiest for us, public mobility, especially semi-urban, peri-urban. There's a lot of demand there. We've not addressed these issues. And I'm not just talking e-vehicles, it's the way people move in developing countries. It's a huge amount of drudgery, it's high risk, it's high time consumption. That is where you need to focus. Electrification of our railways. We are the second largest railway network in the world. We're almost fully electrified. So there's, again, that's carrying passengers, right? Millions of passengers. So each of them are participant in the greening of the transport system. You just cannot say, okay, the government or the Indian Railways has electrified itself. So the way we look at this has to change. The other 2 points I want to very quickly make is the current system of thinking does not look at our current growth paradigms. We are not growing in a post-World War II era. We don't have the same value systems. We don't have the same cultural problems. We don't have the same resource requirements or crisis that they had 50, 70 years ago. But our macroeconomic landscape within which we live and within which our budgets are made, within which incentives are given to people, those paradigms have to change. And one similar example I would give is Swachh Bharat, which was Clean India. And when it was introduced, that's a behavioral change project that is highly successful, but that had multiple layers of work from a government having a mission, not a regulatory mandate. So there are two different things over here. It had a mission, it encouraged people to participate in the cleanliness thing. We have measurements now, like let's say the open defecation has become zero, etc. So you have certain government metrics. But overall, as a people, are we cleaner than before as an ethos? That is the kind of change life is looking at, or anything that looks at lifestyles is looking at. The other thing that I want to say, because it relates to consumption behaviors, is the media that we live in. And Urmi, you would probably be able to add to this, because earlier when we were poor, and Ambassador Puri spoke of us being frugal also as a part of not having the resources to really be extravagant about things. Now with social media, there's an equalizer in terms of desires and needs, right? Which we didn't have. When I was growing up, I didn't have access to how the other side lived. Now that we have that access, that's not only unequal, it's also something that's unrealistic, because we have different resource environments that we live in, and not just monetary. What is the energy source that we use? What is the urbanization style that we have, etc. This is where we see, if not deployed correctly, there will be high dissonance and resistance from the population. And that will in fact impact the political system, which will not follow things like life. So how do we sort of have gentle change? It's very challenging at that point. But without understanding that we overall as a world are changing, and if we just make it, counting GHG emissions and all that, I have my reservations, because then we are always in negotiation mode, and we will always negotiate with numbers, which belie, like India's energy numbers or transition numbers will belie the actual change, let's say 1.4 billion people are undergoing. And we're the first country to develop on a low carbon pathway. Nobody's done that before. Nobody's done that for 1.4 billion people. So, if we just take your per capita is X and my per capita is Y, that's not a clear reflection of the effort itself.
Shiva, it's very interesting that you spoke about the regulatory approach and the non-regulatory approach, and yet every example that you gave was actually a top-down, whether it was through a regulation or through a mission. The fact is, normal people, not those of us who are always in the weeds, but normal people don't really care if it's a regulation or a mission. To them it's government said, so it comes from the government. So at the end of the day, perhaps what we need is actually a system that addresses the questions that you raised vis-a-vis single use plastics. The reason why it didn't work out is because it was done in one go. That never works. Alternatives weren't in place. But anyhow, to move on, I'll come back to you on that. I want to get to Yamid on a question that, in a sense, both Mr. Puri and Shuva have touched on, and that's the negotiations. Uh, it's true that real life happens outside the negotiating rooms, but it's also true that when 200 government representatives of nearly 200 countries are in a room, what is decided there does send out signals. And the one signal that we have got, the signal that we don't really talk about a lot because we are caught up with what we think are more real issues, are is that sustainable lifestyles is no longer a nice thing. It is now something of a deliverable. At least the GST says something to that effect. And I'm wondering, how do we see this become a real deliverable, not something that ends up on the floor and a negotiating floor with all the cutting and chopping that happens? Uh, and how do we make it count in a way that it does not lead to further antagonism? You heard both Mr. Puri and Shuva talk about this. Uh, but I want to move away from that developed versus developing. It's a
Mhm.
contextual thing. Uh, but nonetheless, can you sort of take us through that? Sorry, I
Thank you
can't
very
I
much.
can't give you an easy question. That's not,
Yes,
you know.
and especially after I'm going to be inspired by, the previous comments made by Ambassador Puri and Shova actually. Um, First, I think that within the negotiation, we need to see the opportunity, not just to discuss, how to embrace, this concept, not just to reduce emission, but also to adapt, a sustainable lifestyle, you know, p- provide promises, not just in reducing emission, but also in being more resilient. Um, and I believe that and I will start, with India. I think India will have a great opportunity in the next round of NDC to really demonstrate how it take this mission, you know, live and to share it with the rest of the world. So I think the next round of NDC provide, opportunities, for all countries to see how they incorporate and they're um, boosting some behavioral changes and how they're going to use capacity building, raising awareness as also a means to really get the population, the people to also be part of the solutions. I think the GST. Uh, you know, I think we can behavioral change takes time. So we do not need to look at it 1 year after 1 year. I think next year provide a good opportunity for the NDCs to reopen the debate, to assess, to look at what has been done. There's also the biannual update reports, transparency reports. Actually, on top of the reporting, there's space provided within the negotiations for review. And it's not just, the scrutiny and verification process. Actually, both civil society and government can use the space for sharing best practice. And I think if civil society can ask more questions, um, and government to government questions about this key lifestyle reality check, that's a space that we're not making the most of. And then, in about 3 years, we're going to have another uh, global stock take. And also, we do have the IPCC reports, which is an important tool at the service of the negotiations and of the countries. There's been a scoping meeting just in December, but I think there's on top of the overarching report, there's going to be a report, for cities. And I think what we can do also at subnational level can be very empowering. So I just, wanted to highlight from the NDCs, the biannual transparency reports, the global stocktake exercise, and also some of the IPCC, the upcoming IPCC report, how to leverage this to discuss and to hold ourselves accountable to make some of those changes. I think there's also work programs within the negotiations, that provide opportunities to talk about this, including some response measures, this called, response measures. Sometimes we want to do well, and by putting a premium just on the production side, we could have unintended impact uh, because we overlook the cultural and and the differences among countries. Those nuances that Shuva highlighted as well. We can lead. By trying to do the right thing, there could be unintended impact. So I think that as well. I think there's different opportunities to discuss those issues and to bring back, this notion and consumption. Last, I think there's a lot, two last point that I wanted to make there. Um, Ambassador Puri said that the monitoring and reporting, that question is complicated, for different reasons. But I think Shuva and he mentioned there's different approaches to this, and it does not need to be just quantitative. It can be also qualitative, and there's other means, to help us to make progress outside, UNFCCC. There's been some attempt to get a treaty on plastics. There's the SDG 12, on sustainable consumption and production. So some of those conversations needs to converge. They do not, they should not be separate. But there's more conversation about incentives, eventually under the SDG 12 that, we should take into account in the UNFCCC negotiations. On the biodiversity one as well, because the lifestyle there's an effort to be more harmonious with nature. And there's a couple of conversation also that can be made more coherent. So there's different negotiations happening, and I think it's hard to bring them in a more cohesive way and to leverage, some of the spaces that we do have at our disposal.
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, sort of tying what seems to have been sort of packaged as individual action. We are back to the collective and the super collective, as in the global. Mr. Puri, I want to come back to you. You know, if we talk about sustainable living, the individual definitely comes up. And Shuva mentioned about what's possible and what's not possible. Now, initially, we can talk about low hanging fruits, but the problem is that time isn't on our side, like for the earth on the whole. Within that, we have to make adjustments. Some people get little more, some people get little less, so on and so forth. But if sustainable lifestyles are to become, we have to get more. I don't like using the word, but nonetheless, more ambitious in how sustainable we get without sacrificing the gains that we have made in modern living or our aspirations, without making it seem to be settling for less or frugality. What do governments need to do to step in to make possible sustainable living? Not just the nudging part, but the actual doing part. What do we need governments to do?
Urmi, thank you very much. Let's try to understand this a little bit, and I'm only talking about a focused response to what you asked. What do governments typically do worldwide? They actually shrink the policy space for individuals. So Shubha made some very nice points about her mom. If her mother was living in Chandigarh, she would have had no option but to put up solar panels because the administration there has written that you have to do it. End of the matter. This is what governments do. And what is this negotiations? It's about governments trying to ensure that they have maximum policy space for them to do what they do. What they do themselves is between us, the citizens, and our government. So what should the government do? Look, in India, what is the government doing? It's doing both carrot and stick. On incentivizing, it's incentivizing EVs, the use of EVs, etc. It's doing huge amounts of investments on green hydrogen, all of that kind of thing, so that your emissions come under control through the process of incentivization. On the other hand, yes, they're also cracking the whip, if I may say so. I mentioned the case of Chandigarh. You have no choice, otherwise you'll get fined. And similarly, if you do things on, drainage, on outputs of this kind, etc., all of these things happen. Typically, that's exactly what governments worldwide do and will continue to do, because those are the only tools that they really have in their hand. Now, what is interesting is that some of these ideas come to governments from a bottom up. If there is greater consciousness, people start talking. Governments and politicians, feel that far from it being a pain point, it's a gain point to legislate, make it compulsory, etc. And this is what you start seeing. You saw it in the Western European. Urmi, I started my career when the Greens first got elected to the German parliament. And everyone used to ask someone like me, hey, why do you hobnob with Petra Kelly and Joshua Fisher? And I said, because the CDU guys won't see me, a lowly diplomat from a third world country. The fact of the matter is, look at the changes that they have brought about by merely being present and highlighting the fact. We see that happening in our own lifestyle. Look at this. I'm not wearing a tie. Consciously, I chose not to wear one today. Let me tell you a little story. Let's have a little bit of fun. 15 years back, the Japanese environment minister, Japanese are most patriarchal as a society. They had a lady who was the environment minister. She later on became a very powerful politician, mayor of Tokyo, etc. And she came up with the idea that we should let the air conditioning run at a higher temperature than what was then the norm, 16 degrees centigrade, this, that, and the other. The net result was in Japan, during the summer months at least, the executives stopped wearing ties. And now, 20 years later, the Financial Times has written the obituary of the tie is no longer a fashion icon. These things happen. They happen to everyone. I'm just giving you a global example. But we see that happening in our own lives and in the same ways in which we do so many of these things. So, let's be mindful that as you become more conscious, and social media is making us conscious of what's happening around the world, as we imbibe, we imbibe all the good things. We want to see Hollywood and we want to do all that. As we imbibe all of these things and we learn by each other's example. And let me give you India's perhaps best case of demonstration. The efforts that we have made about popularizing solar power and the reduction in the tariffs that we have brought about, International Solar Alliance and all that, its impact has been tremendous in the global south. Everybody has seen that this is far from being an unaffordable, high capital expenditure, this, that, and the other. They all now say, hey, this is very affordable. And so you also lead by demonstration. And Shuva, that's exactly what goes to the Chandigarh example. Unfortunately, none of us are in the business like corporates of amortizing capex. But at the end of the day, if you could do it for yourself, it would happen. So Urmi, I just want to say this. Governments have a role. That is why these global negotiations. At the level of people, we learn from each other and we are doing it constantly and we are going to be improving. We are not going to not want to aspire what the other one has. But later on, can we do it in a smarter manner? Can we do it in a more sustainable manner? Uh, I also want a car. So did the other guy, but I really need one which does, 2 miles to a gallon? I don't. I can now do an EV. So many things are happening. And I must say what makes me feel very good, that in India, awareness, they may not be able to put it into practice. Awareness is happening way beyond just the major metros. In the peri-urban areas, it's happening, and it's happening, therefore, slowly penetrating around. And can you imagine if there is this kind of awareness in 17% of the population, not driven by poverty, not driven by the need for frugality, but driven by the fact that that's good for us. What is the kind of impact, the demonstration impact and other things? So I'm glad we brought this to the table. Life, the idea of sustainability in consumption, the fact that it is slowly, it may be moving through the paces, but the idea is sinking in with the people. And that is what I believe is an important facet to what we can do to tackle the issue of climate change. Thank you.
Very quickly before I sort of move on, you've been in negotiating rooms for climate, and I'm wondering, has India, do you think India has been able to use its sort of mission life or its focus on sustainable lifestyles effectively in the rooms, or do we still have ways to go?
So, Urmi, look, as an articulation in this very terms, it's relatively new, brought in only in 2021 at Glasgow. The fact that we've got it included, the fact that there has been all of this in the G20 negotiations, in the outcome documents, the fact that, the GST outcome at Dubai mentioned this, certainly is testimony of the fact that when we say people not only say we'll take it because India is a big country, it's a big player, let's be nice to them, something that you started off with. But that's important too. Let's not forget that. Global negotiations are a power game of nations. And India is an important player in that. So therefore, a degree of pleasing is necessary. But if the pleasing is for a good cause, then, frankly, why not leverage your abilities to be able to do it? And we are doing it. It takes time. These things are not easy to do because in our own country, we have things that we need to point out. The very fact that we can't simply say cease consumption. That is not the order of the day. We are not at a level of consumption where you are consuming so much that frankly you could do with far less. It's not the case in this country. Look at electricity consumption per capita, etc. So it is a process that is going on. But India is a country which is committed to doing its bit or more than its share of bit in terms of tackling climate change, whether it is in terms of both mitigation, and I'm not talking about the huge amounts that we are doing ourselves on adaptation, frankly, at our own costs in our own way, on resilience build up, and so on. But as a large player in the game, frankly, you have to put in your bit, but you also have to take on a great deal of responsibilities yourself. That's the manner of what it means by global collaboration. 17% of the world population, frankly, can we really expect anyone to lend only a shoulder? It's not an easy task. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Shiva, I'm going to ask you something that moves from there on. And when Mission Life was launched, was inaugurated, however you presented to the world, it was done with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the side. You had testimonials from I think 80 or 70 odd countries. I can't remember offhand, but basically double digits, high double digits. And I'm wondering what has been the reception of this idea? Not just say, oh, you're doing a nice thing, but in terms of do we see similar things emerging because this idea has come, adaptations, therefore, and how does it therefore become a tool for India in some ways? Not just about spreading the message, but how does it work for us?
So, the concept of being sustainable that we're saying, it actually has resonated a lot with the emerging economies. That, for example, Brazil in its G20 that just happened in South Africa that's coming up. The whole concept of life is that it doesn't have to be identical to India's pathway. So
Right.
they have also taken on the messages of going back to your traditional roots, what you have in your inventory, what can you leverage that your population is comfortable with doing. They're looking at bioeconomy, they're the indigenous populations. How do you do that? South Africa has water problems. Incidentally, Azerbaijan, which is a petro state and was doing COP, etc., they are also running out of water. So it's not like just because they're a petro state, they don't have a sustainability issue that they're looking at from technological perspective. And there's no harm in learning from them if they figure out a way to use water more efficiently or whatever. So Brazil has a different, South Africa has a water problem. They're looking at it differently. They have their own types of indigenous people, their own history, their own civilizational values. So life in that sense internationally is adaptable. We don't have, if you look at the principles of life, they are broad based and they're not saying do A or do B or have a carbon credit card or something of that sort. They're not prescriptive in that sense. Which goes back to the point that you made of between regulation and mission, the reaction that you have from the people when something punitive is put on you, versus when you know what, we're holding your hand, let's go on, let's do. They don't even realize that they're doing a behavioral change thing in many times. And so, which is why the government or even the corporate signaling becomes very, very important. I mean, I remember when we started the ISA, everybody laughed at us. I mean, I was part of the original team in 2014, 2015 that set up the ISA. And everybody laughed. They said, "What's India doing? I mean, what are you going to do about it?" And we used to sit and wait and wait and wait for some tiny African country to come and sign an IMU with us. Today, we have 120 countries that are active parts, including the global north, US and everybody else. So, and it's just been 10 years in a multilateral time frame. That's a very, very short time frame to achieve something. And that's what, I mean, I think I'm sort of trying to say that economies of scale or economies of delivery of a service or a product, I mean, that can suddenly escalate when you find the disruption point of that. And
Right.
life, I would say, unlike a Swachh Bharat or a Pulse Polio or something that really impacts every level of people, has not been promoted in that way yet. And we've had conversations on this. We've been trying to work out econometric models of how do you really measure if the water you're saving during brushing your teeth, what is the, how do you measure that? And how do you add that to like the unit of rupees saved or water saved? How do you include certain provisions in the budget? So that can be then given out as incentives and so on and so forth. So there are 70, 80 actions that they have. And we're trying to see, because without measuring, if you remember the Nielsen box and such, we used to measure TRPs at one point, and certain households had it, and how do you mechanic. So those mechanical systems are still needed, especially when you look at millions and billions of people. But the point that I really want to make, because it's an important platform, and I want to make one point on negotiations, because when yeah, Yamide said that we expect a large NDC from India, and the thinking quite often is, why would we do that? Who else is giving an ambitious NDC? Why would we go and offer ourselves with a
That
gigantic NDC? Yeah,
that's a rabbit hole we can leave for another day.
exactly. So I don't want to go into
But
that. Yeah, yeah.
uh,
So yeah, so my point to that is we don't want to entangle this with negotiations. Something
right,
civilizational and population oriented, if it's reduced to a sort of a did you do it or didn't you do it? And then we're
right.
going to put ourselves into failure buckets. India has failed to do XYZ,
Right.
which is not where it is.
Yeah, but the question here is, I know that you've sort of repeatedly stressed on how things are happening and how, but uh, you know, the fact of the matter is that even in countries where it seems effortless and things are happening, it's a product of effort that's gone on for years and years, where it's become a habit, a regulation that becomes a habit. I mean, you mentioned the EU, but if you travel from the north to the south, you will see the difference in which the same set of rules sort of have in its applicability or in its practice at the human level, because it's bit of it is cultural, bit of it is enforcement. In our own country, my favorite example, I live in Delhi, and the favorite example I have is in terms of driving, where I see cars, two-wheelers routinely sort of ignore the traffic light. And I keep saying the traffic light is not a suggestion. It is much more than a suggestion. There is something punitive, but obviously those guys who are supposed to do the punitive job are not doing it. So and even though jumping, the red light has real repercussions in terms of safety, I would say that behaviorally we are going in the negative. So I'm not with you on this no regulation place.
No, 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 no,
We
no. Sorry,
uh,
I totally am not saying that. I come from Mumbai, by the way, because you said this very particular thing. When I came to Delhi, I was like, oh my God, what level of chaos is this? Because in
right.
Mumbai, we just stand in line, right? We don't even know
Yeah.
what line we're standing in.
See,
So
that's the thing. It's become a habit,
yeah,
and that's
it's
what
a
I mean
habit. So
by
yeah.
mission life.
No,
But
I'm not saying that we don't need regulation, not at all. I'm not saying
okay,
that.
okay,
I'm
good,
saying that
good.
yeah, yeah. No, I'm not an individualistic, completely anarchic
Okay,
behavior patterns. No, I come from a law-abiding like situation. And
right.
what you said that the amount of law abiding differs from region to region. I find Delhi very chaotic, frankly, because I've
Right.
grown up in a far more structured system. No, I'm
Right.
just saying that, what is palatable,
Yeah. Well, I think we have to
Yeah,
increase the
yeah.
level of our palate. That,
Yes.
Jamid, is where I,
Yeah, yeah.
I want to bring you in, because
Yeah.
this sustainable lifestyle is actually a global issue. While there are cultural and local sort of flavors, there are some things that are universal, some things that are universal, like full stop in terms of application, and some of it in terms of how you present it. And I'm wondering then, how do we get to this conversation without, how do we take it there? Because one of the things I notice is that because it is so much embedded in every conversation, whether you go to biodiversity, whether you go to desertification, whether you go to or land degradation, you go to climate, you just go to any environmental conversation, or the SDGs, the sustainable consumption and production, which is at the heart of this issue, comes is there in some form or another. And the one thing we get stuck on is, how do countries actually make that shift? How do they make it possible for their citizens to opt for sustainable lifestyles? Now, sometimes it's just a matter of choice. I can use a gas cylinder like in India that Shuva was talking about, or piped gas, or maybe electric cooking. And so we have the choices. But say public transport, which is one of the issues that is there on the mission life choices. Public transport is only possible when the system is in place, or EVs. EVs are possible only when the infrastructure is in place. Each of these things cost money, and we know where the conversation gets on finance. How do we then make sustainable lifestyle not recede to becoming a poor choice? That means you do without, because that limits emissions, because doing without limits emissions, but instead make it something that we can do. It boils down to the question of finance again. How do we make this possible in the current geopolitical negotiating scenario that we are in?
Thank you. Finance being the crying onions of the negotiations and always the crux. Let me just, move back a little bit and just to highlight, when I mentioned the opportunity for India in its NDC, I did not mention, how big it needs to be. It's a signaling opportunity for bringing innovation, including, on this issue of lifestyle, because we don't see that as often. And it's an opportunity, from the G20 to just continue to take this forward and to highlight how India is doing this, so that we have really the opportunity to discuss and to share experience among countries on how to do it. Now, before also going into finance, one of the things that the Fiji presidency did after Paris, at a time when we were testing what could become the global stocktake, was a Talanoa dialogue. And to do that by bringing different stakeholders, in a round traditional setting where every stakeholders, from the indigenous people, from the mayors, from the business, private sector's representative, to the government, looking themselves into the eyes onto where we are, where we need to be, and how we can get there, and acknowledging where we fail and where we can do better. And I think we need to create and to enhance those spaces. I think we have the opportunity to design this, from Baku to Belém. And that spirit is going to be important, if we want to mobilize and make sure that we get to the trillions that we agreed upon at COP29. But also, and more importantly, we get access to them. Because at the end of the day, even if we get, sufficient amount of money, those who need it the most still don't get it. And this has created a lot of tension. And I think, we see that among countries, but we see that also within countries. And this is where I think what we heard Shuva and Ambassador Puri said is how important the notion of proof of concept, and also coming from the bottom up, is going to be important to hear the idea, because some of, whether at rural level, what we've seen in green villages, how projects led by women, empowered by women, testing the value chain of how, you put you change the lifestyle for a greener, village that really provide better opportunities and sustainable opportunities, for those women in particular as entrepreneurs are owners of their lives. I think those needs to come up also and to be shared and replicated at community level around the world, at subnational level, especially when we see in many other places around the world how governments can be contested, government can be, at federal level it can be more difficult. So the bottom up, I believe, it's going to be really important, and to create space for getting those ideas is going to be important. But when it comes to finance, I think there's been analysis, and NRDC has been doing a lot of analysis on how to get some of the finance done. And it needs to be, we discuss what needs to be done publicly, how to leverage private sector, how to reform the international system that is still the result of World War II kind of architecture, as was mentioned before, that is not fit for purpose to respond to the global challenges now. But what we don't look and we don't discuss is even this other level, subnational, how we go from national to subnational. And so I think there needs to be additional spaces provided. It doesn't need to be only within the negotiations, but spaces need to be provided. And again, sometimes because of all the different cultures, different circumstances, I see the NDC as an opportunity within a country to bring that. Again, this is a signal, this is, with its own flavor, to bring. If you have Talanoa dialogues within the countries, you don't have to call them Talanoa, but how to bring those different voices, and use a different means of communication that are going to be also different for each country, which the effectiveness will need to be tailored to the culture as well.
I think you're very right about that. Though one of the things about any NDC is comparability. So we end up coming to similar metrics. But I think more important is getting the context in place. I think very often we don't expend enough energy figuring out the context. It's those who talk loudest about their context, are most convincing, are able to get that message through. But I perhaps there has to be some way of better understanding the different national circumstances, so that we are able to actually have a more honest comparability. There's a question from the audience, and this is a very India specific question, but Yamid, feel free to jump in, because you will see that this kind of a question would have been thrown at you anywhere on this earth. It says in India, SUVs have been the largest selling four-wheel vehicle category, which is true. Uh, our as our life aspirations, as in mission life aspirations, are not just shaped. Oh no, sorry. By this I mean our life, as in small L life aspirations, are not just shaped by Western lifestyle. We order milk and bread online now. How do we uphold a different model for the world? I think there seem to be a lot of things being asked here, but it boils down to one is matching aspirations with sustainability. B, how those aspirations are defined. Both you and Shuva, Yamid, both of you. I'll start with Shuva. If you can jump in very quickly, give a sense how to this question. How do we do this? How do we actually get to a more sustainable place, which which is sustainable in context and in the collective? And then Yamid, after that?
Um, to my mind, I mean, this really sort of has to be integrated into our life, which is why it's called life. I want to go back to why it's called life. It has to be a natural process. So you're not choosing every time because every choice is a decision process. And I'm not talking buying a car, but every moment of everything you do has to be a sustainable choice, more sustainable choice. So it cannot constantly be like an elite thing or a greenium thing or a conscious thing or, I'm being so great, I'm being sustainable thing. It cannot be all of that. It has to feel natural, which is why the storytelling of this becomes very important. So, which is where our media, which is the way it's packaged. Right now, it's packaged as an elite activity. We call it a greenium. A green vehicle costs more than a normal vehicle. A green process has a tax on it, green tax, this, that. No, that cannot happen. Each
I
of
suppose
us
we
at
need a
every
carbon
second,
tax, so
yeah,
that we
exactly,
don't tax
carbon,
the
yeah,
green and we tax
the
the
carbon. We are
brown.
doing, these
Yeah,
are instruments, right? But
yeah.
as an individual, you and I and Yamid have to be feeling that we are doing everything, like we have to be integral in our sustainability process, which is why you have to go back to, the upstream production process. What are we putting into it? How are we packaging it? I don't want to go into the details because those are the processes of it. The SUV question is interesting because happens in India, if you look at the Indian SUV, still less than 1400 cc, is actually a small car with a big body compared to, let's say, the US SUVs, which are really gigantic vehicles. Now, that is a bit of a marketing thing where the emissions, if I do head to head, it'll be much less for Indian SUVs. But the aspiration question remains, you want a
Yeah.
big car. So then we
Yes.
have to make our big car intrinsically green and not
Yes.
elitely green. And I,
Mhm.
I would really like to say that this is a process of storytelling. It cannot be policy led. What you want is a marketing play. Who makes you want what you want is the story. And that is the
Right.
marketing opportunity here.
Yeah. But it has to
And
be it has to be led by regulation somewhere, because that
No,
will
there's
get
regulations.
the
Yeah. No,
where
because
the
if you
auto
see our
companies make the
SUVs,
move.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
if you see our SUVs, they are regulated by the emissions. We
Yes.
have the Bharat 6 and all of that. That is built
Right.
in, but the customer may not necessarily not be.
Right.
Do I want a
Yeah.
Bharat 6 car or do I want a SUV car? Right. I mean
Right.
that's your plaque.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely. Sorry, I
Yeah.
mean to have cut you off before.
no. I totally agree with, the point that Shuva made. In addition to that, I think we should not see this in isolation. And the transformation is going to, on the aspiration, is going to be driven by the whole ecosystem change. Because if we see, the transformation just within a sector, we are going to be eventually confined in one type of aspiration. But the way we transform the cities, for example, and we see that in Europe, in some places where actually some of the aspiration is shifting from a big car
Yeah.
to a small car, actually,
Yeah.
because of the traffic, because it's a little bit more, easier to maneuver, to park, when there's less parking, because so it depends on how we're going to transform the environment, and how the cities are going to be made more friendly, how, it's going, how easy it's going to be to use public transport. So it depends. There's going to be also, so that's one example. Another example, in some places, can you imagine India, 10 years from now, and the time in the year, when we are already close to 50 degrees C,
Yeah.
but it's going to be even worse.
Yeah.
You could imagine, like, in some places or the places around the world where there's going to be a time of the day where actually everybody would be willing not to use any car, but to stay at home, or not
Mhm.
to, there's going to be almost a pause. In some countries, they even adapt in
Yeah.
creating that moment of siesta. So,
Yes.
which means that, the level of consumption on news, could be affected because of the need to adapt more broadly within a transformed environment. So I think, there's also, those type of things that we can see, and this is why short-term needs always, to be associated to longer term, pathway and vision and transformation. This is why what I liked, in the previous conversation with Ambassador Puri and also you, Shuva, it's how we use, the term, of mission, on top of, just not just the objectives, because so yes, and so that's an aspect I wanted to highlight.
Thank you. We've come to the close of the hour. Tells you how quickly time flies, huh? But one of the things for me, the big takeaway really has been one is that when we're talking sustainability, we need to reconfigure how we present it. It's a bit of a marketing game there, as Shuva put it, but also it's contextual. But I think there has to be an effort to move away from that position where we say, hey, we are a country, or this would particularly be true from the developing countryside, saying we're a country with low emissions, we need space to grow. It's we need to be able to separate sustainability from not growing, or not meeting our aspirations. It's about how we do it smarter. Probably we need to also look at the economics of it, and maybe sustainable lifestyles will it becomes, we get to understand that this is our pathway to the future, that you're not doing without, but you're being smarter, or you're actually moving on to a new opportunity. But obviously the important thing is that we are talking about this, and NRDC, thank you so much for creating this space. uh, to our audience, I would only like to point out once again, please have a look at the climate insights, which give you a better sense, or an anchoring to the conversation that you have heard, and something to keep sort of going back to. And today's title is called Climate Action One Person at a Time. I know that might sound a little strange because we've been trying to push the collective, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, those choices made by each individual, whether because it's a habit, or because it's become a habit, or you're being asked to, or you're being convinced, it's still always one person at a time. So thank you again, and thank you, Yami, thank you, Shuva, and Mr.
Thank
Puri,
you so much.
for your time this morning. And
Thank
thank
you.
you, the audience, for being there and listening to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye bye.
Bye.